Hello, good evening, and thanks again for another edition of Ideas Exchange. Tonight, our guest is a distinguished personality, somebody from a respected family, and a man who played a key role in formulating policies that saw the transformation of our country, especially between 2010 and 2016. I'll be introducing him shortly, but what I want to do tonight is to give you an idea about the background of the man I want to speak to tonight on our program Ideas Exchange. He's a career economist, an expert member of the Chief Economists of Ghana Government Initiative. He has over 45 years post-PhD experience. He has spent decades formulating, advising, implementing policies with African governments. Let me tell you one thing about this area. He has worked with the World Bank, holding various positions, including policy advisory roles in the Western and Central Africa, including advisor to the regional vice president of the World Bank, sector manager of poverty reduction and economic management, and resident representative in Senegal. He has worked on themes and produced publications on topics such as structural adjustment, social indicators, and industrialization. He has taught extensively. Teaching appointments include 5 years with the World Bank Institute, formerly the Economic Development Institute, 11 years with the United Nations African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, and various universities. And of course, he has also worked as senior presidential economic advisor between 2009 and 2016. That was within the period of the late former President John Evans Atta Mills and then John Dramani Mahama. Our guest tonight is Dr. Kadman Atta Mills. He's a president of Solidaire Ghana. He's currently a president. It's a civil society organization. He's a product of Achimota School, and as we speak, is also the advisory council chair of the Atta Mills Memorial Heritage. Dr. Kadman Atta Mills, you are welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I dug your background, and it sounds very exciting to be speaking to somebody like you.
Actually, when you were speaking, I was wondering who you were talking about.
Of course.
Believe me, it sounds much better than it is in reality.
All right. So, Doc, you are the head of the Nkrumah Shreba Shedan Ebusian. You are the oldest of the late Atta Mills' siblings. And as we also speak, you are the custodian of his legacy. How huge is this task?
It's, for me, personally, a very important task. Of course, it's the family that my mother comes from. My mother passed away some time ago, and when I was called to become the family head, I couldn't say no. And I accepted, as a tribute to my mother, the role that she had in bringing me up and bringing my whole siblings up, and the love and the attachment she had for the family. That's number one. Number two, it's a family that I think has made its contributions to Ghana. We, in this family, don't make a distinction between Ejaba and Enaba. The children of the boys and the children of the girls are very much a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And in that light, I can mention one contribution that this family made to sports in Ghana. Of course, people tend to talk about Professor Atta Mills and his role in hockey, but people don't know that Robert Mensah, for example, comes from this family.
Goalkeeper number one.
Africa's goalkeeper number one and things like that, Robert Mensah. In the area of the arts, music, Amanziba, that group, comes from this family. This family has produced ambassadors who have served very well the nation, including Ambassador Kwesi Bru, who was an ambassador for a very long time. And of course, there is Oman Penin, John Evans Atta Mills, who I think has made his contribution to the country.
Now, let's look at the late President Fifi Atta Mills, 10 years on, how is the family, particularly the siblings, the sisters, yourself, Sami, and of course the son, coping with this huge loss, this big pillar that fell 10 years ago?
It was a huge loss, and it's still, very painful, if I don't say so. I'm not being quite candid with you. But at the same time, we are really quite encouraged, because 10 years on, his reputation and his legacy keeps growing rather than diminishing. In fact, some of us had hoped that we will remember him less, so that the pain will be less with time. But people tend to remember him more. And with the pride that we have in him, keeps growing. And I think I'd rather have it that way. I remember him more, and people's appreciation for what he stood for grows with time.
Now, last Tuesday, you shocked the nation when you spoke passionately about the late former president and his integrity, his image, especially at the commemorative lecture that Chachichikata addressed. And your message was direct. Was it out of anger? What could have triggered that caution note that you sent across? What triggered it?
The caution note was very specific. And it was specific to just one individual that, unfortunately, I thought was using the memory of the late president for things that are not becoming and are totally antithetical to everything that Professor John Atta Mills stood for. Ghanaians rightly recognize him as a man of peace. But I don't think he was just simply a man of peace. He was somebody who was a veritable team player, because he was a hockey player. He played in a lot of sports, and you will succeed in sports only if you play in a team and act as a team. And his team was very much Ghana. Professor Mills was one of the people who recognized talent from all walks of life. In fact, if you asked him who he would want to be in his government, he would more likely name people in the NPP than in the NDC, because he knows them, he went to school with them, he knows their worth, and it's irrelevant to him whether or not they belong to this party or the other party, because for him, it was Ghana which was the issue, and everything that he can do to promote Ghana, he would do it. And I didn't feel that what was being done to remember him very much corresponded to his role and his vision as a team player. I also thought his memory was being used to promote individuals and to massage individual egos, rather than to create a unity, to create an atmosphere where people will remember the positive side of him. And yes, it was necessary for me, therefore, to strike the word of caution. He was a man of peace, he was a team player, he disliked unnecessary disputes, and he wanted to promote a unified Ghana, and definitely also a unified family. And I felt that his memory was being misused or being evoked incorrectly to sow divisions within the society, NPP, NDC, within the family, and also particular individuals in the NDC. That's why I sounded.
Okay, so that has been put out there, but there's another issue that many keep wondering about. It is about the Asundre Park. the concept around where our late former president has been put was to create a place like a presidential cemetery. The late Vice President Ali Muhammad died and was not buried there. The late Papisi Emisata, a vice president, died, was not buried there. The late former president Jerry Rawlings died and is not buried there. Now, when you sit back as a family and you look at where our late former president is, do you think that upon second thought you would have thought about where he lies, or as it is now, many people should not be worried about those perceptions about whether the significance of the Asumdwe Park is being achieved?
Yeah, no, I think you said it much better than I could ever say it. Originally, it was conceived as a burial ground for presidents and vice presidents. And to be honest, that was one of the reasons why the family didn't really resist very much, even though we were really under shock and probably not thinking very well anyway. And we felt a little relief that the decision had been taken off our hands and that he'd be buried there. We have made the same observation as you have. And the big question mark is, where do we go from here? Are we going to leave him there by himself? Is there room to consider other options? And much more importantly, if every anniversary of this, there's going to be a major controversy about him, his burial place, and everything else, then we have to ask ourselves if this is sustainable and this is stress that we would like to continue having every year at this anniversary. So the family will take it on that.
Okay, so but before I came here, there was a school of thought, and I want to specifically look at how we captured it in the form of a question. Should Asomdwe Park become a national cemetery for former presidents? Should a law be passed to properly regulate how the remains of our former presidents are handled? From where you sit, the profile that you reached working close to the presidency, how do you respond to this suggestion in the form of a question?
You know, it's a very good question, but I think it's also a question that doesn't take into account our traditions. I mean, God forbid, but I really, really seriously doubt that, God forbid, if something happened to President Kufuor, Asomdwe Park would be an option. Let's be serious. Asomdwe Park was not an option for Rawlings when he died. I don't even think that Kwame Nkrumah is buried in the Nkrumah Mausoleum. Right? So, the original idea was perhaps a good thing, but it didn't take into account our customs and the fact that when people die, there is the sense that maybe they should go home. So, it's now up to the Nkrumah Chirba Trade Ebusia to consider all options. Obviously, you're not going to go and remove the body if you don't have anywhere to take it to, right? So we have to really, really sit down, think very seriously, think of all the options available to us.
Okay, so now let's move away from the late former president.
Yeah.
Now, he has a legacy that stands tall. Before we even walk into some key things you would consider as his achievements, there is one personality who brought him into the political limelight. That is the late former President Jerry John Rawlings. When he was president, many Ghanaians appreciated how he decided to be focused and do what he does or what he did before he was called by the Lord. But there is this lingering perception that he didn't have too much of the best of good terms with the late former President Jerry Rawlings. You were a senior presidential advisor. What did you know? What could be avoided, and what should Ghanaians know if we are still in doubt?
It's so funny, right? Because people really had that perception. And yet, when President Rawlings died, I insisted on writing a tribute to President Rawlings. One, because I personally really admired President Rawlings, and I keep telling everybody who will listen to me, and most people don't like to listen to me, how I appreciated President Rawlings. But it was also the case with President Mills. He had an incredible amount of respect, not just simply for President Rawlings's power and position
Or persona.
or the very fact that he brought him into government, but he really, really respected Rawlings's political acumen. He would say, you ignore Rawlings and you ignore Rawlings's advice at your own peril. And this is one thing that people tend to forget. People concentrate on his boom speeches and things like that. But Rawlings had his nose to the ground. He could feel people's pain. He could feel people's concern. He was a veritable grassroots man. And this is what I think President Mills most appreciated in Rawlings, and said to himself that whatever happens, I will not ignore Rawlings' advice. And of course, I said the same thing to myself too. Of course, Rawlings had his good parts and his very bad parts. He had a lot of bluster. Sometimes he listened too much to other people, and sometimes was quite misinformed. And sometimes when you got a certain point of view, he insisted on it without trying to check. He did a few things that I had to call him out for. For example, his insistence on saying that Prof would have been alive if he had listened to his advice, and his health issues and things like that. I remember I once said he was not welcome to any celebration.
Right.
But it's because of the style and the type of person that he was, right? When he got a certain point of view, right or wrong, he kept insisting on it without worrying.
He was a passionate person.
He was a very passionate person, and some of us are also, right? And sometimes it's very difficult to take. Right? On a number of occasions also, yes, he and Prof had disagreements, not in terms of values, not in terms of objectives, but in terms of style.
Now, there's one other thing that, for example, you as a sibling who worked directly with him, especially at that pivotal role as a senior presidential advisor, we know that at a point in his lifetime on earth, while he was still playing his role as the president, there were times he had to seek Medicare. Did it in any way affect what he was supposed to do as president?
I personally don't think so. Look, I mean, I've been very candid with Ghanaians. Prof got sick, very sick, in 2005, immediately after the 2004 elections. And he had to go to South Africa for treatment and things like that. But given the nature of the sickness that he had to have regular medical reviews and checkups. I guarantee you, he was not sick at the time that, really he died. And there was a very, very steady progress in some of the symptoms that he had as a result of the treatment he had in South Africa. His eyesight was even getting better, right? So
that perception is wrong. Generally, that's what you want to say.
That perception is not very accurate.
Okay.
Obviously, when he went for a medical checkup, he wasn't here,
right,
to see to the matters of state. But I don't think he was a sickly man.
So now let's look at Prof in government. He assumed power at a time when he had a huge hurdle to cross, the single spine salary structure. And it happened at the time when the former president, John Ajay Kufuor, had publicly told labor unions that government had approved those adjustments. How difficult was he able to maneuver through the processes that eventually led to the implementation?
No, I mean, you put it very well, right? Since President Kufuor had made that promise, for President Mills, it wasn't a question for debate. It's a resolved issue, and the only question was, how can we implement it without it having a major disruptive effect on the economy? Well, the first thing that I think Kwabena Dufo, with the help of the Economic Advisory Council, because President Mills set up an Economic Advisory Council to advise him and to advise Kwabena Dufo, was to make sure that the rollout was very well phased and sequenced. Critical employees first. I think he started with the security forces and things like that, and moved on to other groups, including the teachers and so on, while making sure that the rollout didn't put too much of a strain on our resources. Also, in the immediate period of putting together the single spine salary adjustment, he tried very hard to basically squeeze other non-essential expenditure.
When you say squeeze,
it means limit.
That's cut down expenditure from the government.
Hold them, and hold them, constant. Sometimes, you would hear that there's no money. In fact, in the initial period when we took over the government, austerity for other sectors of the economy were the rule, just so that we could honor the obligation to the single spine adjustment without putting too much pressure on the economy.
So at that time, we heard stories that if you were even traveling outside the country and they presented a list of people who were supposed to be on the trip, they could cancel out some people.
They would cancel that. I mean, there's this thing.
What influenced that? Was it the innate tendencies that really influenced those decisions, or generally because there was no money?
Even if there were money, there are essential expenditure that you have. Professor Mills hated. He hated ostentatious behavior. I mean, there is no reason why you should have 500 cars following you when you are going to give a speech somewhere. Huge convoys and things like that. He hated all those things. And he wanted to concentrate on essential expenditure. So he would have done it anyway, even if we had the resources, because that's the public purse. And he hated waste. And there's no reason why you should be wasting money on useless travel when there were schools on the trees, that had to be, basically made whole. So that was his nature. It's not because there's an abundance of resources that he should waste it. And also, he thought it was much more important to invest in critical infrastructure, especially the energy sector. That's why during his government there was a lot of attention paid to Ghana Gas, GNPC, and so on, right? Because he realized that that's the only thing that is going to enable the economy to grow at a very fast pace.
I know you chaired the advisory council that negotiated a $3 billion Chinese loan, which was supposed to be used for the investment in the gas sector, which perhaps saw the Atuabo gas factory we see today, some investment in the London beaches area, the development of the rail sector, and so on. Now, when you sit back, what do you see as the conversation goes on as some of the achievements of the late former president that today you can proudly boast of as a custodian of his legacy?
Yeah. First of all, I think I should take you back a little bit. I did mention the Economic Advisory Council that President Mills set up. I was actually the convener of the Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Govind Nankani was the chairman. And then when Govind Nankani passed on, our own Ishmael Yamson became chairman of the Economic Advisory Council. Now, the Economic Advisory Council took, let's say, the best economists that I think Ghana has produced, including also the best businessmen, the most active businessmen, and they were drawn from all political persuasions. There was, for example, Dr. K.Y. Amwako, who was the head of the Economic Commission for Africa, who was a member. I have never seen him at any NDC rally, and therefore I wouldn't call him an NDC man. Chairman of the Economic Advisory Council, Govind Nankani, received prizes from President Kufuor, as he did, from J.J. Rawlings, as he did, from President Mills, who absolutely adored him. There were members of the council that came from different political persuasions, but were good economists. And they were there to advise not just the president, but also Kabna Dufour, whenever he came with policies. I think they helped very much.
So that could have influenced some of the achievements in the macroeconomic sector. For example, there was, until date, the longest single digit inflation period within that time.
Definitely.
And so the focus was bring on board the best hands to look at Ghana and not necessarily political, parochial interest persons to do the
and Ghana was. And I wasn't the only one who headed an important task force to negotiate the $3 billion loan. There was, for example, Dr. Kwesi Botwe, who was on the Economic Advisory Council, but played a very key role in the reform of the gas sector and the negotiations for the setting up of the gas infrastructure. There was Dr. Govind Nankani, who was the chair, but headed a task force which looked at the Cosmos, ExxonMobil, thing else. And within the Economic Advisory Council, he gave people specific roles to play, all in the interest of making sure that the economy runs very smoothly, in addition to Kabna Dufour, who, by the way, I always take my hat off
for what he was. We'll be taking a short break. My guest on Ideas Exchange is Dr. Kadman Atta Mills. He's the oldest sibling of the late former president, Professor John Fifi Atta Mills. And of course, he's also the custodian of his legacy and the head of the is it Nkrumah, is it Tredan? Nkrumah Cherba Tredan Ebusia of Cape Coast. We'll be taking a break.
We've done well.
When we come back, we'll have some conversation about him and our economy today, our governance today, and what he thinks about Ghana's future.
The average human body mass should have at least 60% water for optimal performance in any physical or mental exercise. We can help you maintain it naturally. X Natural Mineral Water. Simply natural.
Welcome to AutoCheck Vehicle Diagnostic and Licensing Center.
I hear my car can be checked here without going to so many hour crash.
Sure. Emission, check.
Alignment, check.
Brakes, check. Visit AutoChecks at Koforidua Aquadrum Road for the roadworthiness of your vehicle, from saloon cars to heavy-duty industrial vehicles. Madam, your car is now ready for the road.
Thank you so much. Auto checks, check.
AutoChecks, your safety, our priority.
Auto checks. Nyansa Shase, Oni Nyamisro. Power 97.9 FM for the Wisdom Summit 2022. Abobasi. Watson Safre, Reverend D.Y. Donko, Counselor Donko, Reverend Dr. Charlotte Odro, Sofumami Counselor Bako Pe, Dr. Eugene Ba, Oye Embryologist, Na Elder Dr. Nana Amo Toby, Chairman of Tobinko Group of Company, Onusuru Baby, Wisdom Summit 2022. Eye Power 97.9 FM. Majumezini Sinanano Denoru host here. Ajimani, Awani, Osu Presbyterian Church Auditorium. Noye venue 10 a.m. and apartment bro unit time. There's a Jumezino Ashishano. Saturday, 20th August 2022. Isaiah 33 verse 6. It will be the sure foundation of your time. Guest artist your Celestine Donko. Sepade impartation Wusunya Bureau Wisdom Summit Yasa. 9 day ever send attend Ezako number yido 0248 712812. A Sunday yana ya reserve Wusitamo.
What percent will sponsor Wisdom Summit 2022? Fresh 0554 343 167 0554 343 167.
Hey, Wisdom Summit. Nyasa wa warimu. Nyasa wa apomudimu. Nyasa wa yeyomu. Wisdom Summit. Nyasa wa wompenetrimu.
Welcome back. This is Ideas Exchange on TV XYZ. Our guest is a very special personality, huge individual who we know now is the custodian of our respected former late President John Atamils. He's Dr. Kadman Atamils. And I told you earlier about his background. He's done a lot with the World Bank. He's the president of Solidaire Ghana, a civil society organization. So second part of the conversation, we'll look at Ghana today, and of course his influence, observations he has made, and what he thinks collectively as a people we should be doing together to ensure that we protect our country and forge ahead for the future of our siblings and our siblings' children and going forward. Doc, let's first focus on Solidaire Ghana. You are the president. We've seen a few engagements with the public, a few public lectures here and there. What is the focus looking at our current situation as a country?
Look, Solidaire Ghana is a civil society organization, and it's totally non-partisan as far as I know, and that's one of the reasons why I easily accepted to be the chair of the fellows, or the head of the fellows. And the fellows intellectuals, opinion leaders, with their specialty in a number of areas, including law, environment, economics, and so on, and governance set of issues. And Solidaire has as an objective to generate a national debate on a number of questions that are very important to the development of Ghana. And particularly not to be a commentator on day-to-day policies, but to think of systemic issues that perhaps need reforms, areas that need reforms, and to use the collective wisdom of the individuals and also using experiences from elsewhere, put these ideas in the public domain for debates. For example, one of the areas that we were most concerned about, and Professor Tuguba gave a lecture on, was constitutional reform. What should be the purpose of a constitutional reform? How should it affect the three branches of government, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and how should they be balanced? Is it good? And maybe these are questions that we should be asking. To have Parliament to be independent, and how would that its independence, right, be basically manifested and so on. So he is in charge of constitutional issues, legal issues, and he will be working on it. We also think that we have to look at the whole issue of procurement in Ghana. I think if there's one area where I can call it really disastrous, is the award of contracts, the negotiation of contracts, identification of contractors, and its impact on the economy. We have a situation now where the conflict of interest in the awards of contract in Ghana is just simply monumental. We have a situation where the award of sole source contract becomes the norm rather than the exception when people have proprietary products, and therefore you cannot award the contract to competitors and things like that. This whole area basically needs reform. And it's not an MPP problem. It's not an NDC problem. It's a Ghanaian problem, right? And these are the sort of reforms that we call systemic reforms. Things that are not working well or are not giving the results that we think are desirable. What can we do as a nation to make sure that you and I operate in a level playing field? That if there's a contract there and I have the skills, I can compete and compete fairly and be awarded a contract where I make a reasonable profit and yet I'm able to deliver for Ghana. Right now you have situations where contracts are inflated 2, 3, 4 times sometimes. And even after you do the contract, you know, there's also a whole process of standing in line to be paid, you know. It's ruining our banking systems also because contracts are awarded when there's no provision for it. These are all systemic problems that existed under President Bush. Definitely existed under Mahama. It's existing under Akufo-Addo. And we have to look at how.
And so how does Solidaire Ghana hope to drive this? Because obviously, if you look at the composition of the fellows, it cuts across.
Yeah.
But there's one thing, identifying that major problem highlighting the key concerns and bringing the key players on board, either to formulate a policy or a law that will drive implementation or the new approach going forward?
We are not an executive agency, and nobody has given us a mandate to draw plans. So that should be very clear. And we have no pretense. But we do have a hope that we can generate a national debate that will inform the reforms that those in power do undertake. In fact, raising the issue and saying that this area poses a problem is the first step, in finding a solution. And having a national debate is also the second step, where we can all put our heads together. Trust me, if you ask the government in power to reform the procurement system, they will. But they will reform it in their own interest. And they will reform it in a manner that you will not find yourself in, and the ordinary person will not find themselves in. There are people in the oil sector, for example, who know exactly what is wrong with the allocation of premixed fuel, who are aware, how basically the bulk oil distribution is done and things like that. They know. They probably have very good ideas on how systems can be made to work very well. There are many contractors who know that there are some political contractors, they get all the best contracts, and there are the others. They have ideas.
It sounds very painful, and for you coming from a family Ghanaians accept, given the background of almost all the siblings, that you stand for passionate protection of the public purse. Do you sometimes feel like weeping for our country, looking at where we are today?
It's not just sometimes, it's all the time. I hate to use very strong words, but believe me, what is happening, it's unheard of. It's painful. Don't get me wrong. I can see Professor Mills going to the court, angry, basically pained that people are being so corrupt. I can see Professor Mills coming to me with a contract that has been drawn with somebody, and I tell him that this contract is not worth the piece of paper it's written on. The prices have been inflated by 2 times. And he shakes his head, and he's very sad about it. So it happened under him. It's happening now. It happened under Muhammad. And sometimes you reach the point where you realize that there's simply no accountability whatsoever. And it's not right to give a contract to your wife in an area, in a domain that's just never done any work in there. But you do it because you can do it. And there's no accountability. That's one of the areas. But it's not just the procurement. The whole question of campaign financing has been put in the table. Because if any Ghanaian can get up and contribute as much as he, first of all, be sure that foreign companies will be behind him because they'll be funneling their funds through the individual. 2, after he's contributed all that he can, are you going to be able to deny him a contract? So if I contribute 278 buses to 278 constituencies, Eric, are you going to be able to tell me that I cannot get this contract?
Of course.
So the campaign,
your hands will be tied.
Yes. Now, so all these are issues. They are systemic reforms that have to be undertaken before we start holding people accountable for playing the system to their benefit. Because without those systemic reforms, they actually don't even think they're being corrupt. They think, well, that's how the game is played.
How difficult is it advising a president a senior presidential advisor working in tandem with influential persons from political parties, financiers, etc. What does it take for a president to take a final decision and the consequential effects?
You know, I jokingly said during the 10th anniversary that the job of an advisor is the easiest. You can always claim credit for the successes and say, well, the task of an advisor, it's really, really very, it's not good advice to give the first best option to a president if you know that there is absolutely no way. The political reality with what is economically optimal or scientifically or feasible.
Now, I ask this question because of our country today. There is a widespread school of thought that our president doesn't want to listen. There's a perception of action with impunity. And so even when there is condemnation of a certain policy decision, he doesn't appear to care. We have a national cathedral, we have concerns raised about his presidential trips on expensive chartered flights and so on. Do you pity his advisors, or you think it is the individual who is occupying the presidential seat that perhaps has put us where we are?
I would rather not talk about the specific case, right? Because I think it's very delicate. Right? But I was a sector manager, basically responsible for macroeconomic policy in the 13 Central and Western African countries that we talked about. And part of my role was to advise the government on structural adjustment and the policies that they had to put in place. And one thing that I found out, believe me, governments listen to you, presidents listen to you, if they know that the policies they are putting in place will strengthen the credibility of the people who put them in power. It's not necessarily the people who are voting, but it's the people who are governing. You are governing, and the people who contributed to your being in power, and therefore to whom you are answerable if you want to stay in power. In other words, he who pays the piper and therefore calls the tune. The first thing that you have to identify, therefore, are the people that you can't possibly afford to offend. Because if you offend them, the government is finished. In some countries, it's the military. And you may have to make allocations to military expenditure, even though you know they are useless. But if you don't give them the money, the government will not survive. In some countries, it's the farmers, who hold the real power within the society. In some countries, it's the labor unions. You can't put in policies that the labor unions don't like. One of the things that I find a little surprising in Ghana is that I cannot identify any socioeconomic group like the farmers, like labor unions in other economies, and so on.
Who are as powerful.
Who are as powerful, who are as organized.
Is it a recipe for the exploitation of the masses by way of policies that don't seem to address our critical needs rather than the pleasing the wishes of people who govern us?
I mean, when we want power, we go to these people, we solicit their votes, we make all sorts of promises to them. And when we get power, we look to a totally different set of people to maintain us in power. And we forget the interest groups that were responsible for our coming to power, I think if things are going to change in Ghana, perhaps we have to do our politics a little differently. If I had any political ambitions, the first thing that I would start doing would be like Professor Mills, door to door. Identify economic interest groups, the farmers, for example, they are vast. Listen to their problems. Listen to their reforms. Get them at their level to to identify people that they can support, to hold political positions, so that when they get into power, they will advance the economic interest. There is, instead of just simply relying on Nigerians with sacks of dollars coming to finance your election, and you know that after the election you have to basically satisfy them. You basically have to rely on your own people and worry about the economic interest. Worry about how you can advance them. Help them. And then they will hold you accountable also in terms of the promises that you have made to them. And that's the only way that we can get
now, your background and looking at our economy, which is almost foreign dominated. Today, our banking sector is largely dominated by the foreigners. You look at our industrial sector, it's almost the same. Even in that cultural sector, the larger ones which are into exports are owned by foreigners. What would you advise should inform our thinking going forward?
I won't hide from you. I'm an economic nationalist. And I think that even though you are very right, that major sectors of the economy are dominated by foreign interests and foreign corporations. Trust me, even our politics is dominated by foreign interests who use Ghanaians as fronts, right, to contribute to political parties and things like that. That this is not sustainable in the longer run, in the medium run, and we should be grooming our own people. One, grooming them not by making them agents of foreign corporations. That's nonsense. But giving contracts to our own people and let them decide how much foreign input they would like to have. In the beginning, it's not going to be smooth sailing. We'll be making a lot of mistakes. But no economy has been able to develop by relying solely on foreign investment and foreign capital.
If you look at the economic mess in which we are today, and you look at perhaps the opportunities we could have taken advantage of, do you think that we still have room to change the paradigm shift?
We really have done very little to concentrate on investment in directly productive activities and in productive infrastructure. Really, if you think of it, a time of improvement. I mean, that's how disastrous it is. There is no reason that we could not have done a better job in the energy sector. Everybody knows that the cost of production is determined in these days by the cost of energy. The prices that we pay, you pay, on electricity is just insane. There's absolutely no way that you can have an economically profitable sector of the economy paying such high rates for electricity, and it's not even dependable. So that very often with doing so, you have to have a backup generator and everything else to be able to produce. That was one major area that you don't even question investment in that. There is investment in water control. You cannot pretend to be an agricultural society if indeed you have to depend on the vagaries of the water. So water control for agriculture, for consumption, for other activities, it's an investment area that you don't even question. If you have extra money, that's where you put it. Road infrastructure, sure. Communications, sure. Instead, what have we been doing? We've been borrowing money after money after money to pay salaries. For consumption, yes, for foreign trips and renting expense. I said I wasn't going to talk about it.
But it's important. We are wrapping up.
Yeah.
When you sit back, are you impressed with how Nana Akufo-Addo has governed this country for the past 5 years? And if you were supposed to speak to him as an influential Ghanaian who has earned that respect, I want you to look at that camera and speak to Akufo-Addo. This camera.
President Akufo-Addo, things are not doing well in Ghana. The situation is disastrous. I think you know it. I know it. Most Ghanaians know it. Aside from the serious economic crisis, what I call the two disequilibria, your balance of payment issues, which has an effect on the value of the city, and your fiscal deficit, internal and otherwise, which also has an effect on inflation and everything else. These are problems. But in terms of the long-term prospect for Ghana also, things are not improving. In fact, they're getting worse. I will not put the blame only on you. I say to you, Mr. President, you were elected for 4 years. You do have 2.5 years left. It's not too late to at least start some of these reforms. One of the reforms that I think will be very important for you to start is the campaign financing reform that we talked about, because that governs everything, including, by the way, the award of contracts, waste in government, and also excellence, because if you award contracts to people who are not qualified to undertake the job, it's not just a waste, it's actually a crime against the youth who need jobs and who need a future. The other is obviously procurement reform. We've talked about that. There's also emolument reform, not just simply the pay of the Article 71 employees, but even things like government officials taking gifts, so-called gifts, from contractors and so on, which is not neutral because it affects the awards of contracts. There are changes to be made also in the Constitution to make sure that Parliament is indeed, the legislature is indeed independent, that the judiciary is independent, and of course the executive. These are all systemic reforms, Mr. President. These are reforms that cannot wait for 2024. They have to start now. And we will move one step by one step. It's your legacy which is an issue. If you started, I'm sure others will continue. But if you don't start it, it will be a problem.
Okay, so that's Dr. Cadman Atamils. He's the oldest sibling of the late former president. We know his background now, that he's an economist who has done extensive work with the World Bank and several African countries, particularly Central and Western. He's also the Ebusiapenyi of the family, and of course, the president or the chairman of the Fellows of Solidaire Ghana. Is an old student of Achimota School, and last of it is also on the advisory council of the Tamils Memorial Heritage. He's our guest, and I believe that you have enjoyed the conversation. It didn't sound political, it sounded very advisory in all the conversation we had. Lessons learned, and I believe it is for Mother Ghana. My name is Erica Hanyo. Let's meet again next week for another edition of Ideas Exchange. Thanks to all my producers, and good night.